Hello and welcome to Indian Express's Explained section. I am Udit Mishra and I'm here to talk to you about how caste and religion affect India's employment and consumer sentiment. As you know that Bihar has just published its first caste census, and that has raised a lot of interest in the issue of caste and how it affects different people, different professions. So I did some looking around in CMIE data, which is the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy data. They do their own surveys on the economy, and they also collect data on caste. So in the recent piece, I have looked at the data for employment metrics and consumer sentiment metrics and how they vary according to caste and religion backgrounds. So one of the top things that we look at in employment metrics is the labor force participation rate. Now, for lay readers, one should understand that labor force participation rate is basically telling us what is the demand for work. You know, how many people in a particular category of people above 15 years of or more are looking for a job. Some of them might be employed, some of them might be unemployed, but this total number is the labor force participation rate. The second metric we look at is the unemployment rate, which is in common parlance, the regular metric that we talk about. And unemployment rate is nothing but the people within the labor force who were looking for a job but did not get a job. So a proportion of that is the unemployment rate. But the third metric that we have looked at is employment rate. And many experts believe that employment rate is the more important metric for India than unemployment rate. And the reason for that is that employment rate is basically about saying what are the total number of people who have jobs within the larger cohort of 15 years and above. So it gives you a very good understanding, because often in India, the labor force participation rate keeps falling or has fallen over the last decade or so. And that changes the way unemployment rate can be calculated. Because if you imagine for a moment that a lot of people are leaving labor force because they are disappointed because they're not getting jobs, the unemployment rate may fall because a lot of people who were otherwise not getting jobs get out of the labor force, stop looking for a job. So those are the three metrics on the labor front. Then we look at how employment rate changes based on religion, and we also look at how consumer sentiments vary based on caste. So the first metric we are looking for is the labor force participation rate. Now, this is something that has been a massive worry for India, because labor force participation rate has been falling, and that means people are not looking for jobs. Now, that doesn't make any sense for a country like India, because you would expect people wanting to look for jobs. But the reason why it has fallen is because a lot of people get disappointed and leave the labor force. They stop looking for a job. Now, how does that vary across castes is shown in this table. As you can see that for all the castes, the number has fallen from around 46% to just under 40% over 2016-17 to 2022-23, which is the last financial year, which ended in March. So overall, across castes, it has fallen, but it has fallen the most for other backward castes, other backward classes and scheduled castes. Those numbers are close to 8% or above 7%. It is also noteworthy in this table to note that the lowest labor force participation rate amongst the recognized castes here is for the upper castes. They have around 37%, which is almost 3 percentage points or 2.5 percentage points lower than the national average in that sense, and lower than most other caste groups. Now, the second metric is the unemployment rate, which is commonly talked about, and we also know that unemployment rate has been a persistently high problem for us since 2017-18. Even official data has been showing that unemployment rate has been high. And the CMI data on this also is showing that unemployment rate has been fairly high across the board. In fact, if you look at it over this period between 16-17 to the last financial year, you'll find that across most caste categories, unemployment rate has, if anything, gone up. Barring the only exception is the other backward classes, where it has come down a tad. But you have to understand that, again, you have to see this fall in unemployment rate for OBCs in context with the fall in labor force participation rate that we saw in the previous graphic for OBCs. So it saw the highest, the labor force participation rate fell the highest for OBCs, which means a lot of people who were not getting jobs moved out of the labor force. And that is why the unemployment rate has actually fallen for OBCs. So while it looks like a good thing that for OBCs, unemployment rate has fallen across other castes, we have to see this in context of the fact that this is perhaps happening because a lot of people in the OBC category are not even looking for jobs. Now, here we come to the most important metric, which is called the employment rate, which is basically, the proportion of people belonging to a particular caste in the working age population who are employed. And that proportion, as you can see again, has been coming down. So across all castes, that number has been coming down. The biggest fall again has happened in the OBCs and the SC category, where it has fallen by over 7%. If we compare it to the 6-year period that we are looking at. But it's also noteworthy here that the employment rate is the lowest amongst recognized castes in the upper castes, where it's around 33.82%, whereas for all castes, the data is 36.5%. So it's a significant, almost 3 percentage point difference. And it might be higher in OBCs and SCs and even STs. But those are the two main takeaways, that employment rate is falling across all castes, and it's lowest for upper caste, and the fall has been the highest in OBCs and SCs. Now, an interesting thing that was done in the Bihar caste census was that they looked at caste across religion. So when they talk about upper caste, they also include upper caste in the Muslim religion, or they also look at lower caste in the Muslim religion. So across religion, they have looked at caste. So here we've compiled a table where we looked at employment rate, which is, in our view, the best metric to understand the labor situation in the country, across religion. So now if we look at the table here for employment rate across religion, we find that Hindus have suffered the highest fall in employment rate. So, if you look at it, around more than 43% of Hindus in the 15 or more years of age group were employed in 2016-17, and that proportion has fallen quite sharply to around 36.6%. That's a fall of almost 7 percentage points over this period. We also see that if you just look at purely at the employment rate, then it's the lowest amongst Jains. It's around 32.4. So those are two crucial takeaways. If you look at it in terms of employment rate as of now, which religion enjoys the highest employment rate, then it's the Buddhists who have the highest employment rate, which is around 44.4%. The last metric that we looked at was the index of consumer sentiments. Now, this is an index that CMI calculates and tries to understand how are the consumer sentiments in the country. It looks at things like whether you're wanting to buy a consumer durable like a TV or a home appliance and things like that, such questions. It also looks at whether people think that they are better off from a year ago in terms of their income, economic situation, and where do they see them going forward in a year's time. So a composite of many of those questions. And again, you can see that this time the change on the table is on the left-hand side. You can see that the consumer sentiments, these are the index values. These are not percentages. These are the index values. The consumer sentiment index has fallen across the board. So if you compare from 2016-17 to the last financial year, the consumer sentiment has fallen roughly between 20 to 25% across all caste categories. The lowest level of consumer sentiment was recorded for OBCs, as you can see in the data. However, the worst affected in terms of the decline over the last 6 years is the intermediate caste. Now, these intermediate castes are essentially castes that aspire to be part of the OBCs, say a Gujars or that kind of category of castes. So, intermediate castes have been worst affected in consumer sentiment, and OBCs have the lowest consumer sentiment. Those are the two main takeaways. So that's a wrap on the data on employment and consumer sentiment based on caste. So one issue with caste is who in India is aligning with which caste, who they identify themselves as. But if we look at employment data or consumer sentiment data, it comes out very clearly that the OBCs are the worst hit in terms of employment rates falling, labor force participation rates falling, consumer sentiments falling. And when I say OBC, even the intermediate castes which are aspiring to be OBCs, they want to be included, they also have got hit the most. The other big takeaway is that many of the upper castes, that we talk about, have actually had the lowest employment rates, and they have also fallen. So they had a lower employment rate, and that has also fallen. So both the things are happening. One, OBCs have had the sharpest fall, and the upper castes continue to be suffering with lower levels of employment and consumer. That is the takeaway.